Welcome. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Harry Clifton, a poet who comes to us from Dublin, where he was born around, let's say, the middle of the last century, and now lives with his wife, Deirdre Madden, one of the finest contemporary Irish novelists. I have to say that for years when I read or thought about Harry, I never situated him in Ireland, but in one of his many elsewheres, or more often, flying over shimmering waters, the way Saul Bellow tells us the modern writer must. I was lucky enough to meet Harry and Deirdre in my first year as an undergraduate in England in the early 90s, and at that time he had already lived and worked for years in West Africa, Thailand, in Iowa, and Italy. In 1981, he had won the Patrick Kavanagh Award, and that year in London, 1992-93, he published a selection from his first 4 books of poetry, selected poems called The Desert Route, which came with an admiring introduction by the great poet Derek Mahon, who wrote, "This poet has taken the world as his province. Quietly, without self-assertion, Clifton has set himself to work in the highest registers. We are dealing with the real thing. There must be 3 things in combination, I suggest, before the poetry can happen: soul, song, and formal necessity. Clifton has all 3, and The Desert Route will place him among the poets that matter." I have to say this book was an inseparable companion for me during my years as a student and struggling poetaster. And poems like The Walls of Carthage, Monsoon Girl, Euclid Avenue, and others became touchstones for me. And examples of a kind of poetry which combines philosophical exploration, wit, personal honesty, and journalistic velocity. Unlike many of the poems I got high on at that time, they have remained important and grown more rich in the intervening years. Exemplary in their intellectual clarity and ambition, their spiritual and formal complexity and lyrical beauty. He and Deirdre traveled on in Europe and beyond, living in Germany at Worpswede, an art colony known to Rilke lovers, and for a good decade in Paris that culminated in the magnificent collection Secular Eden, Paris Notebooks, 1994 to 2004, which won the Irish Times Poetry Now Award in 2008. In 1999, he published a beautiful prose book about the experience of living in the Abruzzi Mountains in Italy, a book called On the Spine of Italy, followed by a collection of short fiction. In 2000, I believe it came out, Berkeley's Telephone. The period following his return to Ireland in 2004 yielded another fulsome volume, The Winter Sleep of Captain Lemus. This is a beautifully published book, published by Wake Forest in 2012, which it was also shortlisted for the Irish Times Award. From 2010 to 2013, he held the position of Ireland Professor of Poetry, and that chairhood issued in very recently in a prose book called Ireland and Its Elsewheres. And he has continued to teach on and off in Dublin. I believe he taught in Germany and France as well, in Bremen and Bordeaux. In 2014, his US publisher put out a new big selected poems, which you've seen outside, called The Holding Center, selected poems 1974 to 2004. The Holding Center, like many of Harry's titles, has a double or triple bottom. I'm honored he's traveled here to read. I want to thank the Center for the Study of Europe, especially Elizabeth Amrine, for making this possible. I'm honored that Meg Tyler, poet, scholar of Irish poetry and associate professor at the School of General Studies, has agreed to facilitate an exchange with Harry after the reading, when you'll also have the opportunity to browse the books outside. Please join me in welcoming Harry and Meg.
Thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Alissa, for your kind words, and thank you, Elizabeth, for everything you've done to set this up. I'm really honoured to be here. It's actually great to be to be spoken of as a European voice for a change. It's one of those little remarks that sort of sets off all kinds of resonances when you come from Ireland, because we have a rather complicated attitude to what an Irish poet is, and in relation to what you are an Irish poet. You know, you can be an Irish poet in relation to what's happening in Britain, or you can be an Irish poet with half an eye on the United States and what's happening over here. And I think a little bit more rarely you are spoken of as being a European poet, because for some reason Europe is kind of, as Michael Hartnett put it, the Irish poet, Europe is kind of hidden behind Britain. And, or if you like, Ireland is hidden behind Britain in the other direction. So all kinds of complex emotions arise about this and the connections between Ireland and Europe. And I myself, you know, feel very European, but that might be because, you know, I have a certain kind of maybe approach or a vision or range of experience or whatever. And there might be another, in fact, there is another kind of Irish poetry which would be very much concerned with a form of Irish introversion and sort of self-preoccupation, if you know what I mean. As an Irish poet, you are caught, as they say in the economic debate, between Boston and Berlin, and you're asked to choose. Are you on the Berlin side, or are you on the Boston side? Are you sucked into the American force field, or are you part of the other force field, which I think I am. But all that said, I'm going to begin by reading a poem that actually Alissa alluded to in her introduction. It's a poem called Euclid Avenue, and it was written about 30 years ago in Iowa, when I was a visiting fellow at the Iowa International Writers Center, or conference each year they held. It comes from my university days. You know, just what I've actually said there. Growing up in Ireland in the 50s and 60s, you were part of a post-independence Ireland where the poetry was part of what you might call the pedagogy. It was coming from above down, and it was very much lots of early Yeats, lots of folk identity, very, very beautiful poetry. But if, as in my case, you grew up in a city and you had other roots, cosmopolitan roots, you found that you had to go looking for a voice somewhere else. So when I was in university, you know, two things really sort of excited me enormously as follow-ons from my rather nationalistic schooling. And one of them was European philosophy, and the second one was the discovery of modern American poetry. And what I loved about modern American poetry, by which I mean the 20th century American poetry, was that there was this fantastic range. You know, you could be an extreme conservative on one end, or you could be as far out as you wanted to be on the other end, or you could be anywhere in between. You could be a mix of things. So there was this kind of laboratory that you could forage around in, which I adored. And one of the poets I loved, because he was a city poet, was Hart Crane. The the great New York poet. You know, I remember reading everything Hart Crane wrote, right down to his little bits and pieces that he hadn't even published. And one of those little bits and pieces was a piece called Euclid Avenue, which immediately fascinated me because the words Euclid Avenue were like a poem in themselves, even though he hadn't actually written the poem. And the poem in his sort of general collected works is no more than about a line or two. It's a fragment, in other words. But I remained fascinated by that fragment and that idea of Euclid Avenue, which somehow had a strange kind of energy thing locked into it, like a coiled spring, if you like. And years later, when I came to the States, which I didn't do very often, I have a strong memory of being in New York and seeing the subway signs for Euclid Avenue and suddenly making this connection. And then going into the heartland of the States and finding that Euclid Avenue was actually quite a common name for suburban roads, and feeling that there was something about the idea of Euclid Avenue that was quite American and different. And this is really a poem about exploring American energy, if you like, through the idea of Euclid Avenue. And it's for me, I suppose, American energy, you know, I often feel when I'm in America that I'm in a society that's in perpetual movement and that I'm always in the presence of an undertone of automotive power, if you like, and I can hear the sort of ground bass of American life, you know, in the background all the time. And it's an energy that is going outwards, whereas Irish energy is often going inwards. You know, it's a sort of introverted, kind of super historical kind of energy. Sorry about all that philosophizing. All in the name of a small poem, Euclid Avenue, after Hart Crane. The blazing stanchions and the corporate lights, Manhattan over the bridge from Brooklyn Heights, were energies like yours without a home that would not be condensed inside a poem, but endlessly dispersed and went to work for time and money, hovering over the masses like terrible angels. Now I stand in New York and watch those energies sweat themselves out like gases through a subway grill to keep the derelicts warm in a new depression. Or at station bookstalls, calm at the eye of the electric storm, I drink your words like prohibition alcohol, capital hides from itself. On soundless trains through middle America, citizens fishing in creeks that rise and flow nowhere, disappear again in a private wilderness you were born to seek and lose yourself in. But none of them will thank you. They, nor the desolate children whom they raised on 1,000 streets called Euclid Avenue, for traveling inwards, damning with faint praise the forces that they freed, to blast through gravity into a loveless extraterrestrial space, like night bus stations, galaxies of strays, the sons and daughters of the human race. That's probably about half the time for the entire reading taken over with one poem, but we'll move in this global scenario that has been so well put before you by Alissa, back over to Europe, where I lived for many years. mainly after I got married in 1987. My wife and I moved to Italy and began a kind of a private odyssey that lasted about 16 years through various countries. But this is a little poem just about traveling with somebody else, or exile, if you like, which is not just personal, but mutual. In our own city, we are exiles, strangers, through the closed windows of taxis, staring at the selves we never became. How they crowd there, the familiar faces at the intersections. For them too, the lights change, like an illusion of freedom, as they disappear out of our lives. Today, Dublin, tomorrow, Paris or Rome. And the blur of cities is one city, simultaneous, eternal, from which we are exiled forever. And I say to you, let us make a home in ourselves, in each other, as if streets are the statues of public men, or all the doors we will never darken again, are a vanished counterworld to love that throws us together in the back seat of our own destiny, where one dreams and the other gives directions. Like many departures and returns, there isn't ever a master plan, and people usually, when they make major changes in their lives, it tends to be a kind of a drifting into things, with a set of minor decisions or doors opening accidentally and whatever, and suddenly you discover there's a whole life on the other side. And I suppose when my wife and I left Ireland, we never thought we'd be away for 16 years. And living in Europe at a very, very curious and interesting moment, which was the end of the 1980s and beginning of the 1990s, at a time when Europe itself was, it was in some way, it had come to be considered like a museum, Europe, in those years. A very, very beautiful place, but something somehow frozen, if you know what I mean. Nothing was ever going to happen there again. You could come and visit it, but it wasn't going to really have an influence, so to speak. And of course that changed very much, and the ice broke, if you like, around 1989. And the old energies that had been buried sort of, emerged from the permafrost of all the Cold War years. Seems a long time ago now, but it was very, very, it still is a crucial thing. I think it re-established Europe in many ways. And it's one of the things I've loved about Europe is that its capacity for dying and resurrecting itself. And the energies that seem to be there are deathless in a strange way and crucial, I think. I'll just read a couple of poems around that sense of Europe that I felt when I was in that heartland. This is from a house we lived in way up in the mountains of the Abruzzo, in an area east of Rome. We lived there for a year. The mountains, the Apennines, are made of porous rock, which means there aren't any rivers in the mountains, and any water that's there is spring water, essentially. It's coming up through the rocks, which makes it a marvelous place for, thermal baths and spas and things like that, which is a very sort of 19th century thing all over Europe, that sense of going to the spa and taking the waters and so on and healing yourself. There's a lovely sense of that in those mountains. And this is really an evocation, if you like, of a Europe that is coming to life again, and its buried energies, I suppose. And it's called Taking the Waters. There are taps that flow all day and all night from the depths of Europe, inexhaustible, taken for granted, slaking our casual thirsts at a railway station heading south, or here in the Abruzzo, bursting cold from an iron standpipe, while our blind mouths suck at essentials straight from the water table. Our health is too good. We are not pilgrims, and the 19th century led to disaster. Aches and Baden-Baden, where are they now? Those ladies with the vapors sipping at glasses of hydrogen sulfide every morning, while the pump house piano played and Russian radicals steamed and stewed for hours in their sulfur tubs, plugged in to the cathodes of revolution. Real cures for imaginary ailments. Diocletians or Vespasians. History passes, only the waters remain, bubbling up through their carbon sheets to the other side of catastrophe, where we drink at a forgotten source through the old crust of Europe, centuries deep, restored by a local merchant of poultry and greens, inscribing his name in Latin. That was a particular spring just down the road from the little mountain hamlet where we spent a year, 1988, 89, just at that moment when everything was going to change, although it wasn't totally clear at that time. One of the lovely things about Italy for me, and I don't know if you have them here, are fireflies. Do you have? Do you call them a firefly here? What is the word? Is it something else? Sorry? Yeah, that's a beautiful word also, yeah. This is what I love about those creatures is their slow motion flight. And the fact that you can actually, in the dusk, you can see them glowing on and off, and you can actually run after them and sort of catch them while they're still alive and hold them in such a way that the light is sort of pulsing out through your fingers as you hold on to them, and it's a lovely thing to see. This is a little evocation of that sense of connection with the other world of the non-human, the divine, if you like. It's called Firefly. It was zigzagging along in the dusk when I snatched it out of its path of flight, like the hand of God delaying it temporarily between the why and the wherefore of my cupped palms that glowed like a votive lamp pulsating yellow. So I knew it was alive in there, in the attitude of prayer I carried ahead of me on the latening road. A principle, a mustard seed of light that belonged in the dance of atoms around me. Energies the dark released, and I too had a hand in. I'll just stay on that mainland. Just want to read a poem I wrote a little bit later in that Odyssey around Europe. It's kind of a vision of Europe in a way, but back in back in earlier centuries, before the existence of nation states, when there was travel, but it was between principalities and small local powers, if you like, that were endlessly at odds with each other. And it was a marvelous time of scientific discovery and astronomical or astrological discovery, but also a terrible time of plague. And I think one of the things that's extraordinary, one of the things I suppose I'm fascinated by in Europe, not so much love isn't the right word, is that mixture of light and darkness in the energies of Europe. You know, I often think of Europe as the conscience of the world, because it has lived through things in some ways that other parts of the world might yet live through, but haven't lived through. And when I use the word conscience, I don't mean good conscience necessarily. I mean also bad conscience of the world. The incubator, so to speak, of things that often come to terrible fruition in other places as well as in Europe itself. So this is an evocation of an earlier Europe, but it's more of a timeless Europe in a sense. And it's called the land bridge. The land bridges in this sense mean roads that connect regions. The land bridge I'm thinking of here is the old sort of trade route and pilgrim route from Paris to Rome, which passed through the Alps and passed in particular through the city of Siena, which was the great banking city of this period. So if you just get a sense of the forces at work, I think that's the main thing here. And this is called the land bridge. All the way south, there was only this road, twisting through the mountains to Siena and beyond. A sanded track beaten flat by pilgrimage, littered with axles, broken felloes, endings. Flooded out of season, losing itself, reappearing in the moon landscape of the alpine foothills, ghastly with mile-high silence, unbroken but for bird caw and rockfall. And suddenly the olives, silver grey, and the true south starting. In the distance, Siena, allegorical, dreamed of before ever met with, shimmered before us. Then the long approach between sanded tumuli, the feminine swells of the Tuscan hills, with the factions perched in their hawks' nests, jealously watching, and the skies ever bluer, the heat increasing, and Paris, from where we had started, so far behind us, in a space measured only by footfalls. Through the north gate we entered to a pride of spires, fine counting houses, streets full of rats big enough to feed on in siege time. Vain women, vain men, with a preference for red like their painters. Coinage stamped with the she-wolf stolen from Rome. A delicate skein of allegiances quivering, unspoken on every breeze. The Romans, the French, to the east the Florentines, north on the pilgrim route from Augsburg through the mountains, the emperor on the move with his flaxen-haired soldiers. Autumn. From tree to tree the mist nets spread for migrant birds, and the nets on the ground for olives. Venison, game, good wine. Winter and spring we lived in that ideal under the sign of gluttony, science, art. Then started north with the roads still open and the skirmishes out to sea already visible. Over our shoulders, Siena, dwindling, still could be seen when the first buboes purpled us. By the mountains, in the ghastly foothills, our dead, unburied, swelled and burst at every turn. How many rats were travelling with us, anyone might guess. But that we were carriers, no one doubted. Plague spots on our faces, in our pockets, new cosmogonies. Okay, so much for Europe. How are we managing for time? I'm going to turn the boat towards shore, bring us back to Ireland at some point. But I'd like to read a little poem called Citrus, which is still somewhere between the south and the north. It's quite a domestic poem for a change. I'm sorry about these huge overview type things. You know, I realized when I was putting together this group of poems that, you know, sometimes people really like to hear, and rightly so, about the small thing, you know, in which the whole of life is concentrated. And alas, things went differently on this occasion. However, here are a couple of small poems. They revolve around the colour yellow, which is very important to me. This is a poem about trying to raise a lemon tree in a northern climate. Where Deirdre and I live in Ireland, we have a very small flat, but it has wonderful big windows, and it's possible to grow plants on a kind of greenhouse basis just inside the glass. So the effect of the Irish winter is kind of minimized, and you can occasionally get amazing things to grow. And one of them is a lemon tree. So it's a poem about south and north, I suppose. And it's called Citrus. All lemons are green to begin with, all oranges. Ours, the nurslings of grey Irish light, turn yellow in winter. Meanwhile, through October, in the tall windows, higher than human height, incarnate joy against the logic of seasons goes on ripening. Slowly, a solstice approaches, drenched in cold moonshine, when the little tree, self-pollinating like a private mystery kept behind glass from a collapsing world, goes south in itself, beyond poverty and death, to infinite yellowness. They are selling it already on the Sicilian squares for less than nothing, as the sun moves up through the latitudes now to catch us unawares at the back end of January, still waiting in the days that never rise above themselves, to slice it for its zest against the grain of whiskey, the false lift of gin and tonic. I forgot to mention that the lemons are actually quite useful. You know, they're not purely aesthetic, and they've ended up in many a hot whiskey over the years. So God provides. Yellow is my personal favourite colour. I'm one of those people who believes, perhaps wrongly, that he can remember the moment when he was born. Some people's memories go back, say, 2 years, 1 year, whatever. Others, have a sense of being born. And there are some, even like Samuel Beckett, who believe they can remember when they were in the womb, They have a prenatal memory. Now, whether it's true or not that I remember being born is almost beside the point. The point is that I believe that I remember that I was when I was born. And I have an association with a wonderful yellow light, which was my very first memory, sort of indefinite, indeterminate light. And that has remained with me as sort of a primary image, if you know what I mean. And the poem I'm just going to read here is about flowers that mean a great deal to me, which announce the Irish spring and which come in great waves across the land. And they are the daffodil, of course, which takes its time actually crossing the country. Are they a big flower here? Daffodils, yeah. I'm never quite sure if these things translate across huge geographical divides, but this is a little poem, Daffodils. I hunker down and see the daffodils at eye level, with the light coming through them. It has happened once before. I am being born. There is yellow light, indefinable, but absolutely pure, irradiating everything. Maybe a vein or two, my mother's or my own, the yolk of an egg or a streak of red in a bloodshot eyeball. Either way, the world in its primary state being given. Ever afterwards, yellow is my colour, and it multiplies endlessly. But nothing is the same. The spring comes in. Again, it is making windows of itself, to be seen but not seen through. Okay, that brings us on this little odyssey back to Ireland. And I wonder what I thought I might do is read a couple of Irish poems after if there's any, this kind of situation is very much, a give and take thing. It's very strange to me actually in a way to be up on a lectern here at all, because it's a false position to be in. I think it was Mrs. Mandelstam who said that the difference between a poet and a philosopher was that a philosopher or a priest was always on a superior level to the people he or she was talking to, and so therefore the words were being decanted on the principle of unequal levels, whereas the poet is one of the people who he or she is talking to, and therefore everything is happening on it's an act of friendship, really, So, if there was anything that occurred to you or that you wanted to ask out of those poems, don't hesitate to do so, because we can talk a tiny bit around this area or this work, and then I can just bring this home with a couple of poems about Ireland, and this might be a moment to do that. Yeah. And I can't guarantee to answer the questions. As Patrick Kavanagh, the Irish poet, said when he was being interviewed, I reserve the right to tell whatever lies come into my head. So on that basis.
I'm intoxicated listening to you. I apologize, but I've kind of slipped into this wonderful reverie. I don't know if it's your accent, Harry, or your connectedness to all the Irish poets I love. Hearing you read, you sound way more Irish than when I read your poems.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah. At least I have one taproot back into the local situation.
It's interesting because you're like Odysseus, who has wandered the world to find himself poetically. And now you've returned to this place of your roots. And I wonder what kind of challenges you faced in returning. Because in some ways, it might be easier
Enormous
to be
challenges.
Irish when you're abroad.
This is a little book I've just published, and it's called Portobello Sonnets. And it's about the area that I moved into when I came back to live in Ireland 12 years ago. And it's a little cycle of poems. And it's sort of a chronicle about just what Meg was mentioning, actually, the crisis of moving back from what seems like a larger reality into a more cramped and perhaps dangerous reality in some ways. And maybe could I just read the opening sonnet? It would answer that question more simply than anything else. And this won't take long. You can relax, don't worry. This is coming back into your own country with a sense of almost dread, in a way, having made previous attempts. It's the first sonnet. Dublin under sea fog, dreeping weather, salt air blown inland. The cab turns west at Brady's Pharmacy into the nightlit drizzle of Harrington Street. And now for the acid test. Alive to the danger in this monkey puzzle of ancestry, this maze of one-way streets. Are you not scared, young man, of your daddy's ghost and his before him, waiting here to greet you, latest of blow-ins, ready to try again? Is this where you get off, where the heart still melts for the millionth time, old snow becoming rain off the Irish Sea, a flat in the Jewish quarter? Immerse yourself. Disturb the human silt, an anchor feeling for bottom in home waters. I hope that conveys an anxiety, because that's about the best I could say in terms of how I feel about bringing it home. Yeah. I don't think people, I actually don't think people govern their lives rationally at all. And you're quite right about all the moving around that I've done. But I would be quite wrong to rationalize it in its happening. And I have a strong feeling that it's more like shipping the oars in a boat that you're supposed to be rowing, and finding in a strange way that the boat drifts back to where it began, if you know what I mean, almost by not acting rather than by acting in a curious way. Yeah. Sorry, Alissa, yeah.
I was just wondering if it, oh, really? I think, I don't know if I need this. Okay. If, you know, my experience of writing in English living for years in a non-English speaking environment makes me suspect that your sense of the language must have also changed after you moved back to Ireland, because for so many years you were writing and communing with the language, but not in the sense of daily interactions, except with Deirdre maybe. But has moving back to Ireland changed your sense of the language, or has English itself in Ireland changed a lot since you left?
I think both of those things. I think the language in Ireland has changed in the same way that language in many countries has changed, because it's become an element in mass media, and it's been standardized, and that's happened in Ireland too. It's become quite an Americanized English. That's a big change in Ireland, I would say, even over my lifetime. But that whole area you bring up, I won't go into it in any great detail, but I think there are a couple of important things. When I lived in all these countries that have been alluded to, I was very defensive about my language. And I had a definite feeling that I wanted to cocoon myself. And I'll tell you one thing that I didn't want to do a lot of was translation. Now, not everybody would agree with this. And I know that the wonderful poet Elaine Ní Cuileann was here a couple of weeks ago. Some of you may have heard her. And Elaine would take a very different view from me, in the sense that she loves the porousness of languages and, you know, sort of melting into each other. Whereas I took a very hard line when I lived away from Ireland on preserving myself within a cocoon.
I remember you said you took pride in speaking French badly.
Well, that was more because I just didn't like the French language. Somebody made a terrible remark about the French language when I was there. It makes everything rise like pastry, which is, in other words, everything has to be overstated in French, whereas you try, I suppose, in doing what I'm doing to understate things as much as possible, or to minimize them, I suppose. I had a defensive attitude to my own language when I moved around, and I didn't want to get sucked into this what is it they say, fluent not fluent, what's the word, illiterate in several languages, that famous phrase, being illiterate in several languages. I thought there was a danger. Yeah, that's not the whole answer to your question, but it's something anyway. Yeah.
I'm very much enjoying this reading that you're having.
Thank you very much.
And I've recently been introduced to your poetry, so I have a lot to learn about it. But I'm fascinated by the descriptive nature that you have. You have such a way with words that it lets us, you paint word pictures. But it goes more than that, because you're connecting thoughts and ideas and countries and just many things at the same time.
Well, thank you very much.
And I just wondered, as you were growing up, when did you start being able to see the world and to think about it in your mind and then to put it down on paper? Like
Another huge question. The fact is, I am a child of mixed ancestry. Growing up in a country where there was a kind of official Irishness in the 50s and 60s that came from the top down. It was very much to do with major institutions, like wonderful institutions, but they kind of defined Irishness to an enormous extent, like the Gaelic Athletic Association, the Catholic Church, the Christian Brothers schools. There are one or two others. The Irish language, the Irish language as the official language, and so on and so forth. Many wonderful aspects. But if, for instance, your mother was from South America, as is my case, and your parents, though involved with the struggle for independence, had a name like mine, which is not an Irish name, it's a Lancashire name, actually. There was a tendency to keep quiet. Let the public space belong to other people in those years. This is all apropos of what you're saying about other countries. I grew up with a very complex sense of being Irish, and it involved other countries, right from the beginning. Right from childhood, there was that sort of dichotomy going on. And I knew from very early on that I was going to have to get out of Ireland to find the other half of who I was, if you know what I mean. I just couldn't find it all within the context of Ireland at that time. I wouldn't be alone in that, but that was certainly the case. So, yeah. I'm constantly aware of your kindness in being here and not wanting to hold you any longer than your patience can endure. But will we take, if there's any one more question, then maybe I'll get back to reading a few poems and just bring it back into the
Wait.
Sorry.
After your 16 years abroad and you went back to Ireland, did you find your poetry changed, or was it just
I think the 16 years I lived away from Ireland were the best years I've ever had for writing. And I think the reason for that is that Ireland, for me, was a place of emotional ferment, which is not the ideal atmosphere for writing. But when I left Ireland, I found there was a wonderful sense of detachment and peace and I could see things from an ideal distance, if you know what I mean. And that settled me very quickly. And I felt I was at a sort of ripe time in my life for dealing with a lot that had gone before, and not just in myself, but in my forebears as well. So I think the answer to that is absolutely. You know, it was absolutely crucial to get away for me. And I sometimes wonder how things would have gone if I hadn't. So, yeah. In short. Can I come back to Ireland imaginatively for a few minutes and
Please.
talk about a part of Ireland which is very close to me now? I married into it 30 years ago, and it's not Dublin where I grew up. It's in the north. It's mid-Ulster, and it's an area around the big lake, which is Lough Neagh, which is Seamus Heaney country actually. It's a very special landscape. It's sort of half water, half sky, a sort of deliquescent blending of elements into each other, so that you're constantly, you're never sure if you're in the sky or in the water, and the light effects are continual. And the water table there is just below the fields, the level of the fields, so the water's always rising up through the fields. So you have this constant feeling that water is a major sort of, that you are living in a sort of semi-aquatic sort of element. And the other thing that's famous for is eels. This is the great area in Ireland for eel fisheries, commercial eel fisheries, because Lough Neagh has a sandy bottom where the eels can kind of mature after their migrations, and they sort of become fully grown eels over the years that they spend in the bottom of the lake. It's a muddy, sandy bottom, and at certain points then they migrate on certain nights across the fields and start their migrations back. They have a thing called an Eel Supper in that part of the country, which is when people decide to fry a few eels, these big eels, and have them with mashed potatoes and invite everybody around. And the eel, I don't know if you've eaten an eel. Some people hate the idea of eels because they're like snakes. They have this sort of overtone or undertone of whatever you want to call it, you know. And they're also a very oily fish. So there's a very strong kind of, when they're cooking, very strong sense of the eel, a strong flesh, and lots of things. I wrote a little poem called The Eel, which was, I think, also about, it's about poetry, and it's about being a poet, and it's about how you metamorphose, and you are never totally one person. You are everything that you become. And this is called The Eel. In the crowded yard, in the oily blue smoke of an eel supper, the eel looks on. He is home for the summer. She is home for the summer, metamorphosing the one in the other, androgynous, ambivalent, slipping in and out of the local, the universal, reading about itself in the book of the eel as a disappearing species, toying with its own myths, renewing its passports, wondering whether or not a child is possible, longing unconsciously for autumn, as the tractor roars all night and the pilot lights flash in the fields outside. For the night phosphorescence of cities, the lifelong shedding of skins. That raised a few eyebrows when it was published a while back, but I avoided the debate. and got on with life. Here's a poem about matriarchy. You might have gathered from things I said that my background is a complex one. My mother's family came from South America, and there was a whole tradition back there of women who were not very domestic, wandering women in a certain sense. And my sense of motherhood, you know, what was having a mother or a grandmother on that side of the family, was very vague. I don't know if it's deliberate or not, but I married into a family of very, very remarkable women, very strong women, women who had many, many children, and women who were very, very gifted carriers of history and culture, including my wife. And it was kind of very settling, I suppose, in one way, to get into that matriarchal world, and almost erotic in a way, but also, combined with that strange watery landscape, that half night, half day, half water, half sky that I was describing. So in some ways, you would not know which side of existence you were actually on. This is a poem which plays with the idea. It's a very melancholy sort of landscape, very flat. There's a wretched hackneyed joke about Irish marriage proposals, which you may know, which is this thing of the Irish man asking the Irish woman, how would you like to be buried with my people? Which is supposed to be the great statement of the melancholic nature of the Irish mind in its approach to things that are life-giving, life-affirming, and so on. Somewhere that creeps into this poem, which is called Burial with Your People, with your people. There's a little church up the road from my wife's family house where she always points out to me as the place where I will repose in due time. Burial with your people. Mine are scattered everywhere, but yours. On the lee side of Corrigan Hill, a windbreak from eternity, wet clay, the cladding for my bones unfolds itself. Maternal ground, I have wandered the earth far all my life. A plot the size of a double bed I lay myself down in tonight, unzipped in my birthday suit. I should never have got you talking on any of this. Even there, you whisper, my hand will stray, and I feel it creeping along my thigh, in death as in life, an earth spirit working its protective magic about me, till I yearn for the little death, foreshadowing the greater. Tendrils, taproots, tingling ions of sex and death in the country dark. Now, I suppose, I will never wake to anything more than perpetual half-light, where the rain in squalls, like Jesus Christ, goes waltzing on the waters of Loch Ness. Country cousins sneeze in adjacent rooms, adjacent coffins, blacked out, while we go about our natural work of roots and continuities. And I hear you whisper, how does it feel to be buried with my people for the millionth time? To say yes, as once long ago I must have done, was to take the plunge into more than marriage. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. you.
More questions? Or I don't want to
Anything you want to ask, fire away.
You said that you were a bit frightened returning to Ireland, and that your time away was maybe your most productive or the best time. And I'm reminded of, I can't remember who said this, but someone said that when it comes to writers and artists, Ireland is a fertile mother and a barren nurse. And so many Irish writers had to leave. Do you feel like you had to leave, like Joyce had to leave?
Huge question again. But the answer is yes, absolutely. In my personal case, I think it probably saved my life. And you know, that remark you made about Ireland and being a fertile nurse and a barren mother. Or a barren nurse, yeah. My feeling about Ireland actually is it is a very nurturing place to start as a poet. This is to slightly take your metaphor and just pull it in one direction. It's a very nurturing place at the beginning because you are always in the presence of living poets who are actually quite close to you in the sense that you can see them on the streets, you can talk to them. So they seem to be valid a part of your society, if you understand me. You can get close to them, whereas I often feel in big societies like this, or certainly when I lived in France or Germany or wherever, the poet was completely invisible. You know, you never knew if there were poets around. Whereas in Ireland you did and you do. Now that's fine up to a certain point, but at a certain point, I think what's nurturing becomes claustrophobic. And I think what you can learn in your early days from that situation, later on, I think you begin to feel you need to create your own space. Or certainly I did, because of my complex ancestry. It's different now because Ireland is a much more multicultural society. But in those days, it wasn't. So you are very much either on the inside of the given culture or you were not. You know, and I wasn't. So I needed to make another space for myself. That was my reading.
Can I ask you something about American poetry?
Yeah.
Because you said that European philosophy and American poetry were the making of you.
Yeah.
And I loved your comment that Irish energy moves inward and this American energy moves outward. And what were you discovering and reading?
Our pioneers
Bishop?
keep striking inwards and downwards. Who wrote that?
I wonder, whatever you say nothing. Right.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
Sorry, you were going to say American. You were asking a question.
Yes, I was. I was interested in what drew you to American poetry because your energy is still moving inward.
I think Irish poetry had certain themes that didn't speak to me because of my background and the tensions in my background. And I often feel one of the problems with Irish poetry is that it tends to recycle certain myths again and again. And I have to say, since I'm in the States, that one of the reasons for this is because Irish poetry often seeks validation in the States in the form of grants, money, awards, professorships, fellowships. America is a place where an Irish poet can make a living or can be helped in that way. And that has a side effect, unfortunately, which is that the Irish poet tends to deliver what he or she thinks is expected over here. But in my observation, the bodies, the Irish American bodies over here that are generous towards Irish poetry have a very retarded view of what Ireland is. You know, the clock has stopped a long way back. And inevitably there's an element of nostalgia. You know, it's the people away from home wanting home to stay in a certain way, you know. So none of that speaks to me. This is what I'm saying to you. You know, I got nothing from Irish poetry at that level at all, you know. I wasn't writing about the famine. I wasn't writing about emigration. I wasn't writing about the loss of the Irish language. You know, certain themes that just recur again and again. You know, certain forms of Irish victimhood that can also, you know, people can make lives out of them, actually, you know. So what did I get from Irish poetry? I got the moral example of a few people, like Patrick Kavanagh, who had the misfortune to stay in Ireland, but who had very strong intellects, and who should perhaps, like myself, have got out at certain times and didn't, and whose tragedy was that they were intellectual people in a lyrical world. And I was very aware of the dangers that that led to. You know, it was a very destructive environment, the poetry world, for certain types of person. People who were intellectually, you know, whose work emphasized intellect rather than the lyrical quality, would suffer in Ireland to this day. And it's no accident, I think, that the major writers of Ireland, Joyce, Beckett, Yeats, and I'm thinking of the later Yeats here, ended their lives out of Ireland, all three of them. And they only were sporadically in Ireland, and they had a very tense relation with Irish culture, because intellectually it gave them nothing, and it was quite hostile to them, you know. I suppose I'm saying it's an anti-intellectual world in certain ways.
I think you see that.
But it exports its lyricism over here.
Well, I think Paul Muldoon and Colm Toibeen feel more comfortable here.
Yeah.
Because they don't have to conform to a certain model.
Exactly.
I was talking to Michael Longley in Belfast last spring, and he was frustrated with the critique about him because he listened to classical music and he listened to jazz, and people said he just wasn't Irish enough. And that somehow that made his poetic presence lose integrity because he couldn't produce the image of the pitchfork or the eel. I don't mean to. That signified, here I am, an Irish bard.
Yes. Well, I think with Michael, there's a secondary element. We're talking about Michael Longley, who's another great Northern Irish poet, alongside Seamus Heaney and Derek Mahon. And I think with Michael Longley, it was that he explored a unionist tradition rather than what would be called a native tradition. Yeah. And that I suppose there will always be people who say, well, the unionist tradition is not really our tradition. Do you know what I mean? And there will always be a sense that it's a minority tradition, it's essentially British, and that Michael Longley's many poems, which are wonderful, about his father in the First World War, are beautiful, but they elaborate a kind of Irishness that many sons of the Republic would not feel is their Ireland, you know. So there's a special case with Michael Longley, I think, there, you know. But this issue of the lyricism, the exportable lyricism of Ireland is one that I feel strongly about, I must say, you know. And I do think what happens between America and Ireland is to blame for it in many ways, you know. And I also think, sorry to go on about this a tiny bit, but I think it's a really important point. There's a power relation at work beneath all this so-called cultural thing. which is that a thing that strikes me about Irish poets is that many, many of them come to the States to work and live. But I'm often surprised by how little they comment on American life. You know, it's almost as if there's a sort of tacit agreement to say nothing critical about American life in case you're biting the hand that feeds you, you know. And there's a sort of conspiracy of silence there that I find disturbing, I suppose, you know. The small country feeding off the larger power and maybe not wanting to say anything out of order, you know.
That's right.
Sorry, that's a very long
No.
remark. But
I'm just curious what, apart from Hart Crane, what American poets have sort of remained important to you over the years?
a great challenge to me is to try and write in open and closed forms. I love the idea of poets who can work in closed and open forms. And so you've got people like Theodore Roethke or Elizabeth Bishop who've managed to write valid poems in both media. That fascinates me, I must say. So, you know, there are abiding influences in that sense, you know. But, you know, a great philosophical poet like Wallace Stevens, I mean, to me, I came upon Stevens when I went to university. I still remember the Professor Dennis Donahue, he's teaching in the States now. The first thing he did to his first year students was he got up and he took out Sunday Morning by Wallace Stevens and he read the whole of Sunday Morning. Great, great poem about the loss of religion. And to me, this was a revelation coming out of the Irish world. I suddenly realized, wow, there's this American poetry there, and it's all there to be explored. So, yeah, I could go on. I could list. I won't, but I could. And I love the freer ones too. O'Hara, he's given so much, you know, legitimized whole areas of feeling that we wouldn't have. You know, Allen Ginsberg's panoramas, particularly the 50s and 60s, that included so much, you know, because Irish poetry was so locked, in a sense, in a set of lyrical cliches, you know, but Irish life itself was getting more and more complex and citified, you know, and it wasn't in the poetry, you know, so these people they unlocked something and let energies in, you know. They were great to read at that time, yeah.
What kind of a conversation were you in with Ireland during your 16 years abroad? Were you going back? Were you?
There was a poem I would have loved to have read here, but it's too long. It's called A Gulf Stream Ode. And it's very much about growing up on the west of Ireland, having the kind of ancestors that I've spoken about, feeling that you're growing up in a small country, but that you're part of large earth energies, if I could put it that way. The Gulf Stream, for me, is the great epic of Ireland. You know, it's not a verbal epic, but it's a climatological epic, because it's a mood-creating force in the whole of Irish life. You know, we get these fronts that come in off the Atlantic. The southwest wind is blowing in our weather all the time. It creates the mood of the country. And, you know, I grew up in that, with that sense, partly because of my ancestry, that there was something out there that was larger than I was being given to believe. And I think the 16 years that I spent out of Ireland put me in touch with those big energies. And that's kind of what I'm most interested in now, is sort of big earth energies, global energies. A poet who fascinates me is a French poet, St. John Perse, who exactly 100 years ago, I was in China in the autumn, and I went to visit a place in the mountains north of Peking, where he wrote a very famous poem called Anabasis, which is a study of civilizations coming into being and passing away. He was a French diplomat. He was stationed in Peking during the war. And he grew up on a little island in the Atlantic, like I did, a Gulf Stream person, and his poems are large epic poems about wind and birds and primary things. And I suppose more and more now, I'm in tune with that world. You know, I'm tired of writing about nationhood and history and things like that. You know, the big energies. That's what I found out. Yeah. Listen, you poor folk. It's time for you to go and get something to eat, other than the thin fare of the intellect.
So, would you read After Ireland, even though you're
After.
looking for those global things?
After Ireland.
After Ireland.
Yeah. Having said that I didn't like a lot of Irish poetry, he said, backtracking, one area of Irish poetry that I absolutely love is very, very early Irish poetry, which is, you may know, which is very much actually like Chinese poetry. It's very, very fine, clear landscape poetry about winter and the lives of hermits and things like that. And very elemental poetry. And this is a poem, it's kind of about a latter-day hermit, in a way, as if Ireland, having been through all of history, has come back again to just being a wilderness that it once was, when the first hermits wrote their poems, those very beautiful early Irish poems. And it's called After Ireland, for obvious reasons. And it's really, if you can just think of yourself as looking out over an empty, desolate bog landscape with various things in it, then you've got the gist of this poem. After Ireland. And the tone of this poem is, I hope, the tone of early Irish poetry. After Ireland. I had three delights: nature, books, and the bodies of women. Let that be enough, the hermit says. Enough and then some. Already we are forgetting the essentials. Food and warmth in winter. For this, remember, is Ireland. Skylight, soul life, they come after, with the passing of things. But listen, in the distance, cars, that dark mechanical roar, and the calligraphy of vapor trails in air, and the notion of heaven, of retribution, melting like exhaust fumes in desecrated space. To be on earth, in Ireland, the nicotine of a woman's kiss, narcotic, the chassis in the bog, the broken axle, slowberries in autumn, whiskey in winter, deer returning to dark, reforested hills, self-consciousness without God, a solitude, a self-sufficiency feeding not on roots, but the dream of roots. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.